When I was about 10 years old, I remember playing this video game in front of my dad. And the game's called Wolfenstein 3D, so if you're a millennial like me, you probably know of it. It's a pretty violent game, and my dad is looking over my shoulder watching what I'm doing, and he sees me killing all of these people. And he's thinking, geez, I don't know, should a 10-year-old really be playing this? And so I explained to him that, I'm a US soldier in the middle of World War II, and I've been captured by Nazis, and so the only people I'm killing in the game are, the bad guys. And thought that was good logic at the time, but my dad didn't seem to think that that meant, I should still be playing this game. And I often think back on that as kind of the first time that I really ever thought about the role of moral judgment processes and characters and stories and what they mean. So today I'm a professor here at OSU, and this is what I've devoted my research to, trying to understand stories, why we spend so much time with them, why we think about characters so much, and ultimately, what does that tell us about who we are as people? So stories and our psychological processing of them have been studied for quite a while. Two of the founding thinkers in our field, Jennings Bryan and Dolph Zillman, came up with a definition of stories that was basically, stories enlighten and delight us through the fortunes and misfortunes of others. So for example, Cinderella. And this idea of seeing certain characters experience really positive things and really negative things and how that can produce joy or even despair in us is something that's been thought about for quite a while. Literary studies and literary researchers have thought about this quite a bit. And one of those was Kurt Vonnegut, the author of Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle. And Vonnegut argued that if we look at stories, we can actually plot out their shapes from beginning to end in terms of good fortune and bad fortune. Are good things happening to characters or are bad things happening to characters? So we can think about a story like Cinderella, and we can kind of plot out its trajectory. And so we see Cinderella start in a really bad place. Her mother has died, her father has remarried, and now he's passed away, and she's left in the clutches of this evil stepmother. Now, her fortunes benefit somewhat throughout the middle of the story. She gets visited by a fairy godmother who grants her wishes, allows her to go to the ball. But then her fortunes decline a little bit when the clock strikes midnight. But by the end of the story, right, she's whisked away to live happily ever after. Not all stories follow this perspective, right? Even stories that end in a happily ever after kind of situation don't always look like this. If we looked at something like The Lion King, for example, we see a very different shape of a story, right? Simba starts in a great place, but then his uncle kills his father. He's in a really bad place. He gets banished from his kingdom. But then by the end, he rises ascendant and ends up happily ever after. Another rags to riches story you might be familiar with is Scarface, about Tony Montana accumulating a massive drug empire, but then at the end of the story having this great fall. So we see these stories and we see these patterns, and we also see that these patterns repeat throughout stories, right? A story like Pretty Woman looks a lot like Cinderella. And if we think about this, this provides us with a nice explanation of kind of like why we might feel certain ways during stories, but it's missing something. If we look at The Lion King, we have to realize that it only has this shape if we think about it from Simba's perspective. If we think about The Lion King from Scar's perspective, for example, it's a very different story. He starts in a really terrible place, ends up in a really good place, and then at the end he falls. So what is it that determines whether or not we're happy at the end of The Lion King like Simba is, or that we're very sad and devastated like Scar is? And ultimately, it's our feelings about characters. Characters serve as the lens that we see stories through. And whether we like a character or dislike a character allows us to be really happy when they succeed or sad when they fail, or the opposite of that, really happy when they fail or very sad when they succeed. So characters have lots of different attributes of them, right? They might be competent or incompetent. And so trying to figure out why people like certain characters is a really hard problem. What we found, though, in our research is that perceptions of morality are the biggest predictor of who you will like in a story and who you will dislike in a story. And so morality is this kind of overarching framework that allows us to kind of understand the development of story liking and story character liking. Now, you're probably thinking, well, morality is this kind of like careful, deliberative process. We think about right and wrong. We reason. We make an educated judgment of whether or not something is right and wrong. But recent research in moral psychology indicates that morality is not so much about weighing evidence. It's more about feeling things, right? You don't have to necessarily think through a situation. You might have an immediate emotional response that tells you this is wrong or this is right. And so morality is moral, but it's emotional morality. And it's also divided up into many different things. It's not just one morality, it's many different forms of morality. Moral foundations theory is a pretty popular theory of moral psychology, and it posits there are 5 different domains of morality: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity. And so you gotta have characters that are maybe really nurturing while also being unfair, or maybe really respectful of hierarchies and authority, or very disrespectful of those. And so it's 5 different things really that we need to think about when we're thinking about these moral judgments. So we've done a lot of work looking at perceptions of characters related to morality, and I want to share some of our findings with you. So here on this chart, we can see in the top panel a general pattern that we would expect, right? Heroes, villains, and anti-heroes are 3 very common character archetypes. We see them in all types of stories. And we also know that these should represent some type of moral continuum, with heroes being the most moral characters, villains being the least moral characters, and then anti-heroes falling in between. And when we do studies asking people to generate lists of various heroes, villains, etc., that's exactly what we find. This linear pattern of moral perception, and also a linear pattern of liking with these characters. Now that would be interesting alone, I think, but it gets even more interesting when we start to realize that within one of these groups, not all characters are created equal. Within anti-heroes, for example, mobsters and pirates are 2 very popular character types that we've seen in lots of stories. But these 2 different anti-heroic characters have different moral perceptions. Pirates tend to be more caring and more fair than mobsters, but mobsters tend to be more respectful of loyalty and also respectful of authority. And this makes sense based on the stories that they are in and how these characters typically behave. So we see these patterns of morality, and we see that morality is predicting things like liking and desires for characters to have positive endings in stories. And whenever I tell people this, I always get the question, well, what about people like Walter White? What about people like Tony Soprano? All of these anti-heroes that I know are immoral, and I still like them. Why is that the case? So my grad students and I in our lab, we've done a lot of research on this, and we have a really good, kind of elegant explanation for what's happening here, and it's called character interdependence. When we're presented with characters in a story, we're not necessarily thinking about objective morality. Is this a good person in the real world or overall? We're often comparing them to other characters. And this comparison process allows us to see that while Walter White, for example, isn't a moral character, he's a more moral character than the other characters that are there. And this allows us to keep rooting for him throughout the story. So if we look at something like Breaking Bad, phenomenal series, if you haven't watched it, highly recommend. It starts with Walter White being a kind of like positive family man, pretty moral, but then he has to start selling methamphetamine to pay for his cancer treatments. Now, if anybody decided to sell methamphetamine, we might say, yeah, that's a kind of a bad person, but he has an antagonist that he's up against that is worse than him. Walt's willing to sell meth to pay for cancer treatments, but he's not willing to murder anybody. Crazy 8, the antagonist from season 1, is very willing to kill people. Now, by the end of season 1, spoiler alert, Walt does decide he needs to kill people. But what happens at that point? Well, now we get a new antagonist. We get Tuco Salamanca, no longer a low-level drug dealer, a high-level cartel member who is a complete psychopath. Tuco gets killed. We get replaced with Gus Fring, a complete sociopath, even willing to kill his best friend in front of Walt just to scare him. And so by the end of the series, Walt's getting worse and worse and worse by dispatching of all of these antagonists. And so the creators are left with like, well, what do we do at the end? Who do we have that's even more immoral than Walt is at this point? And then we get introduced to the neo-Nazi biker gang, right? So we really leaning into that idea of an irredeemable character. So we've discovered some of these interesting patterns that kind of reflect maybe contextual morality, independent morality, things like that. And so I wanted to talk about where do we see these same things in real life. And so the first area is going to be very familiar to probably everyone here. One area we see this is in sports. Right? Sports is another area where we have really liked teams and really hated rivals. And the only thing as good as an Ohio State win is a Michigan loss, right? And when they fight each other, right, on the football field, we're really rooting hard for Ohio State. But we also see contextually dependent morality in this situation. I bet there aren't too many MSU Spartan fans in the audience today. Go Green? See, I was right. However, come football season, when the Spartans are playing the Wolverines on the football field, I bet it's going to be really easy for you to pick which team you're going to be rooting for, and it's going to be the better team in that situation, obviously the Spartans. Now, another area where we see this is in interpersonal relationships. Have you ever had two friends that you both really like, and they start dating one another, and then they go through an incredibly bad breakup? Really hard to stay friends with both of those individuals. We see this type of process in stories as well. Captain America Civil War, we have a really liked protagonist, Captain America, and a really liked protagonist, Iron Man. But by the end of the film, these individuals start fighting, they become rivals. And you have to pick a side, right? You have to pick a side because their relationship has changed and now you're picking one side or the other. I bet the side you picked was based on whether or not you thought they were doing the moral and right thing. Moral in terms of your gut feelings, your emotions, right? Is this good or is this bad? If you think that the Avengers are hurting too many people, maybe you're high on care, and you think they need oversight, you're probably going to side with Tony Stark. If, on the other hand, you think oversight maybe hurts the Avengers and prevents them from saving more people in the future, maybe you side with Captain America. But it ultimately comes back down to who's doing the right thing, who do I approve of their behavior. So I've talked to you about some fun stuff that I like to think about, stories, and I've tried to tell you how it's working in the real world. Through all of my research, I found that stories act as kind of a mirror for us. They reflect our moral judgment processes back to us in a way that we're really willing to tell you what we're thinking because, of course, it's just a story and it doesn't matter. But having listened to this talk today, you probably are starting to understand that, hey, maybe these things do matter a little bit. So I think the more we study stories and the more we learn about stories, the more we'll ultimately learn about ourselves. Thank you.